I don't think anybody wanted to go to the Caribbean in the 17th century. I don't think anybody wanted to do that, and certainly not the Irish that were sent there. Now, of course, that changes later on, but in the 17th century, they're being exiled, essentially. I mean, I think that the stories of the Caribbean from the 17th century were not ones of return. So I think it was the Caribbean was a place where people went to die, essentially, right? Because of the diseases, because of the heat, because it was so foreign, and because it was, it was considered quite dangerous in that period. And so I can't imagine that many thought they would return. So plantation work is hard work. Plantation work in tropical climate is incredibly hard work. So I think there's the sort of labor, not to mention being, like the kind of dehumanization that both probably would have experienced, the treatment, the racialization that they both would have experienced. For enslaved people in the 17th century, it's not just the enslavement in the Caribbean. It's the capture. It's the hold-in cells in the west coasts of Africa, in these hold-in cells, and then the transportation, the Middle Passage, and all the evidence we have about that, how horrific that would have been. So for many of the Irish, they would have known, they knew the English, right? And many of them who were Barbados, for instance, or exiled, were fighting. They were fighters. They were rebelling, right? And so they kind of, I would say, they would know their enemy. They knew who they were dealing with, right? Yeah. While I think for many of the enslaved Africans, and not just the men who were perhaps prisoners of war and then enslaved and transported to the Caribbean, but also, the millions of women and children as well, right? Like this would have been some of the stories, some of the archives that we have are, enslaved people talking about, formerly enslaved people talking about, just being terrified of these sort of white ghosts and not knowing who these people were, what they were, where they were going, they hadn't done anything, weren't involved in any kind of anything. So, I imagine for both, it was quite terrifying. The Catholic Irish and Africans were actually racialized in very similar ways during this period. And so if you look at some of the early narratives of like English involvement in slavery and English ideas of racial difference, it's often the same language that they're using to describe Africans as they are describing Irish, the Catholic Irish, right? And so I think, and also there's there's other similarities. So the plantation itself comes from Ireland. The concept of the plantation comes from Ireland, right? And so there's all these other, so I don't think they're actually, during this period, that separate. They're both sort of colonized peoples, right? And they're treated in very, and seen in very similar ways. And so I would say that they were actually, at least in the mind and the treatment of the English, are actually incredibly similar people, right? I know today it's like there's this massive difference, right? But I don't think that difference was as dramatic in the 17th century. And I think that this is across the board. I mean, in the Caribbean, indigenous people as well had, there was indigenous and African communities. Same thing later on in the 19th century when Indians were brought over as indentured workers, and Chinese people were brought over as indentured worker because of the way that they were treated. That there was a bond, I suppose. There was often a bond that was formed, and I think that often happens when people are oppressed in very similar ways. They bond together.